and keeping up with the old saying of try until you succeed, South Africa has prepared a new trade deal for the US. Details of the new offer are not known yet. However, the Ramaphosa government has hinted at increasing imports of US poultry, blueberries and pork. Pretoria remains determined to explain to Trump that South African exports are not a threat to US production. The US is South Africa's third largest trading partner after the European Union and China. However, South African exports account for only 0.25% of the total US imports. South Africa is trying to reason with Trump, a strategy which has rarely worked with the US president. Trump is not happy with South Africa's domestic and international policies. Trump has accused the Ramaphosa government of discriminating against the white people with policies like the Land Expropriation Act and the Black Economic Empowerment Act. The US president is also irked by South Africa's genocide case against America's ally Israel. And one of his biggest issues remains South Africa's BRICS membership. Now, Washington has also accused Pretoria of abusing racial minorities in its recently released human rights report. The Ramaphosa government has slammed the report as deeply flawed and has repeatedly denied Trump's charges. South Africa is not only facing external pressure from Trump, but also internal conflict. The second biggest party in South Africa's coalition government, the Democratic Alliance, thinks that US tariffs are likely to remain until and unless the government changes some of its domestic race policies.
The issues the Trump administration has are not isolated to trade. There are geopolitical issues that they have flagged, and there are domestic issues in South Africa that they flagged. And it is very clear that while we've been negotiating...
Welcome back to 10 Minutes with Kuhle, the only show where we remind you that South Africa, remind South Africans rather, that socialism, corruption and incompetence don't magically become policy just because the ANC slaps a green and gold sticker on them. Well done. And today, oh boy, South Africa's ruling party, the ANC, is throwing one of its classical tantrums. Why? Because the United States, yes, that capitalist empire they secretly rely on for trade, investment, and food security, had the audacity, the arrogance, the sheer audacity to ask the ANC to actually behave like a serious government. At least they asked. Now, so here's the situation. Let me break it down for you. Washington has now outsourced its refugee resettlement in Africa to Kenya. That means 30 Kenyans need South African visas to help manage refugees moving from here to the US. Now, the ANC is furious. They are stomping their feet, waving their little red flags, communist flags, should we insist, and insisting, dare America tell us who we should let in. Meanwhile, the irony is so thick you could cut it with a panga. The same ANC that can't keep our borders closed, the same ANC that allowed millions of undocumented migrants to just stroll into South Africa without a visa, passport, suddenly cares about 30 Kenyans coming here legally. Why? Because the Americans asked. Now, apparently, illegal migration from Zimbabwe is not a problem. Congolese warlords slipping through our Tambo. Business as usual. But when the US files one visa request, it's suddenly an assault on our sovereignty. You can't make this stuff up. Now, of course, this isn't really about the Kenyans. This is about money. So Donald Trump slapped South Africa with 30% import tariffs with a possible 10%. And you'll ask why? Because he is tired of giving sweet, hard trade deals to countries run by corrupt socialist parties who despise America but still want American markets, American investors, and American taxpayers to fund their fantasies. And wokeism. And the ANC's response is cry, whine, submit 3 different trade proposals, all rejected, by the way, and then act shocked when Washington says, guys, fix your policies first. Imagine that. The Americans are asking for 4 simple conditions. So compensate landowners fairly when you expropriate land. The basics of property rights. We don't live in Zimbabwe. Treat farm murders like the serious crimes they are. Shocking, I know. Don't make American companies jump through racial quotas and DE hoops just to do business here. And maybe, just maybe, stop singing songs about killing white farmers at political rallies. That's it. That's the big, scary capitalist ultimatum, which I might tell you is actually a lot easier than other countries. And the ANC, they're horrified because for them, this isn't about trade. It's about pride. Their Marxist pride is hurt. How dare the capitalist Americans remind them that business, trade, and investment don't run on revolutionary slogans? How dare they? But on contracts, property rights, and actual law and order. I'll remind you that, by the way, we don't charge BE on Chinese and Indian companies. Now, if you think the ANC is negotiating in good faith, think again. While sending envoys to beg Washington, who actually did not go, for a trade deal, our very own army chief was in Tehran promising friendships, hugs, and military cooperation with Iran. Yes, Iran. The country chanting death to America on a daily basis, burning the American flag. The country under sanctions. The country that literally wants Israel wiped off the map. So let's recap before moving on. ANC says, please, Mr. Trump, lower your tariffs. We need trade and investment. Also, the ANC says, by the way, we're arming up with your biggest enemy. Hope that's cool. This is like asking your bank for a loan while posting TikToks about how much you love robbing banks. You just can't make it make sense. And just when you thought, the clown show couldn't get any funnier, South Africa hasn't had an ambassador in Washington since March. That's right. No one's running the embassy. The Americans won't even give Ramaphosa's special envoy, Mcebisi Jonas, a visa. He's persona non grata. They don't take him seriously, but the ANC, they're still packing their Louis Vuitton bags for yet another high-level delegation to Washington, because that's what, they do best, which is to waste taxpayer money on luxury travel for meetings that achieve absolutely nothing. Now, let me tell you what's the real problem. Here's the bottom line. America is tired of South Africa's nonsense. They are tired of dealing with a government that won't protect private property, won't protect farmers from slaughter, won't stop singing genocidal slogans at stadiums, and won't let American companies invest freely without being shaken down for BEE or EEA points. The ANC's response is, we will not change our national policies just to suit another country. Translated, we'd rather sacrifice jobs, exports, and economic growth than give up our ideological toys. It's socialism before citizens, pride before prosperity. And that's why South Africa is collapsing. Because in a free market world, you don't get to demand benefits while spitting in the face of the very countries keeping you afloat. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's move to COJ. We're talking about 500 million rand story here. It's R500 million because that's how much the Gauteng ANC government is throwing at, wait for it, renovating Johannesburg's collapsing hostels. Not rebuilding them, renovating them. You know, not converting them into proper family units. You know, they've been promising that for years since Mandela was still in office. No, just a fresh coat of paint, some tiles, new paving, and perhaps a press conference in a hotel in Sandton. Ladies and gentlemen, it's government wallpaper, you know. It's a poverty with a facelift. It's the ANC in a nutshell. Make it look good for elections. Ignore the actual problems. That's what they are so good at. Now, let's talk about this cosmetic scam. So let's set the stage. Gauteng's Human Settlement MEC Tasneem Mutara and Joburg's Human Settlement MMC Mlungisi Mabaso. I don't know why these exist. Well, there's a department called Joburg Housing, but they waltzed into the hostels last week to inspect their 500 million refurbishment program, to check if things are going according to the tender plan. And what's the grand plan? It's to fix plumbing, replace cracked walls, waterproof walls, repaint, retile, repave. In other words, they're throwing R500 million at a glorified maintenance. Now, if you're thinking, hang on, that sounds like the stuff a building supervisor could do with a few contractors and a fraction of that budget, you'd be right. But this is the ANC. A leaking tap costs 10 rand at Builder's Warehouse. Under the ANC, suddenly it's 10 million and requires 3 tenders, a cousin, and a B front. Here's the part that makes residents furious. These hostels were supposed to be converted into family units. That was the promise. Get rid of the apartheid era single-sex hostel system and replace it with proper housing where people can live, you know, with their families, safety and dignity, all that good stuff. That was the transformational dream. Highlight dream, not vision. And now that dream is dead. Did not even take off. Instead, you get quick fixes designed to keep collapsing walls standing until election posters go up. Now, one resident, Siyamthanda Nkabinde, nailed it when he said, prisoners and hostel dwellers are equal inmates. One is physically incarcerated and the other mentally imprisoned. Now, think about that. That is deep. People feel like prisoners in buildings that the ANC claims they're improving. Can't make this up. It's not me that said this. It's not me. Now, residents aren't stupid. They see exactly what's going on. Mdumiseni Mia from George Koch Hostel said it's plainly these renovations are just a trick, you know, Potomac City, to make people think the housing crisis is being solved. He called it hoodwinking. I call it electioneering with taxpayer money, because that's all it is. The ANC isn't building dignity. They are building illusions. They are spraying perfume on a rotting carcass and hoping no one notices the smell. And 500 million rand later, residents still won't be living with their families. They'll still be trapped in overcrowded, unsafe, cockroach-infested, collapsing infrastructures, just with shinier tiles and lights and a tap plastic one for that matter. Let's talk numbers, R500 million for 6 hostels. 6 hostels. That's about 83 million rand per hostel. Do you know what 83 million could actually do? It could build hundreds of small family housing units, create property, build something new that gives people dignity and security. But no, not in the ANC's infinite wisdom. ANC doesn't do value for money. They do value for tenders. That's why in 3 years' time, we'll probably discover that the tiles are falling off, the pipes are leaking again, and the paving has crumbled. But don't worry. By then, there'll be another renovation budget and perhaps a commission of inquiry into the hostels. Now, people like Shalaza Mbata, who's lived in Denver hostel for decades, call this what it is: betrayal. Because residents were promised real change, real homes, real families under one roof. Instead, they are told to be grateful for new paint. It's like giving a starving man a shiny plate, but no food. And to make it worse, even government officials admit the truth. MC Mutara says, and I quote, "Yes, the long-term goal is to convert them into family units, but that's expensive." Close quote. Translation: we don't want to spend money on dignity. We want to spend money on window dressing, and electioneering. Expensive this. This government blows billions on VIP protection, ministerial cars, corruption scandals, ghost employees, and failed SOEs every single year. But when it comes to giving poor South Africans actual homes, suddenly the piggy bank is empty. So this just goes back to the rotten priorities. This is the formula, waste hundreds of millions on cosmetic fixes, hold a press conference, and pat themselves on the back after painting, and hope no one notices that the actual housing crisis remains unresolved. They don't want transformation. They want a photo op. They don't want empowerment. They don't want to empower residents. They want to control residents with false promises, so they keep voting ANC. It's not about dignity. It's about deception. Now, let's move to our last story. This is on Dr. Lwazi Lushaba, a political science lecturer at UCT, who's crossed the line many a time, to be honest, from critique to incitement, with statements so divisive they are corroding the minds of South Africa's youth. You'll wonder, who's this guy? Now, he has come out declaring no friendship between blacks and whites. Now, to first-year students, Lushaba reportedly declared there is no possibility of friendship between you as a black person and you as a white person. That wasn't nuanced debate, it was ideological dictation. Right? And happened recently. And in a 2017 exam, he asked students to explain the impossibility of friendship between blacks and whites. I'm not making this up, Now, this isn't teaching, it's indoctrination. It's weaponizing classrooms to harden racial divisions rather than fostering understanding or reconciliation, creating some form of a dialogue. Now, let's move on to something a bit more touchy, because I believe in the Judeo-Christian world. So in a pre-recorded lecture, delivered to first-year students just before Holocaust Remembrance Day, Lushaba claimed that Hitler committed no crimes. All Hitler did was to do what white people had normally reserved for black people. Now, the Democratic Alliance obviously came out, including the Daily Friend, the SA Jewish Report, came out. This statement doesn't contextually, it's nonsense, if I have to be honest. It's I don't know what to say, except to say the DA filed a complaint with the Human Rights Commission when he made that statement a few years ago, condemning the remarks as racist, offensive, and vile, which they are. So this guy is out, he even went to University of Limpopo to teach this rubbish again, went to Wits, UNISA, spreading all of this. Now, Lushaba's conduct isn't limited to words. He's disrupted academic activities multiple times, trampling ballot boxes, physically confronting fellow academics, and storming protests when the Dean of Humanities wasn't a local black South African. The incident earned him a reprimand. That's all. That's the rational standard. That's all that happened to him. He was also accused of xenophobic rhetoric, suggesting undesirable candidates based on nationality, driving wedges between South Africans and other Africans. That's your guy, guys, and he has not been stopped. It's crazy. I mean, I can go on and on about this, But obviously, public reaction has been fierce, Students and community members blasted his Hitler defense as shameless and hateful. And I quote, someone said, Lushaba is a racist anti-Semite. That's what someone said. Someone said he's truly appalling. There's just no good stories or good sentiments coming out of this, except to say this is why we need to cut the amount of communists we have teaching our kids at varsities, because the only thing they do is to spread hate and spread this idea of we can all share. Trust me, that doesn't exist. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's remarkable that Lushaba remains employed at UCT despite mounting criticism and his track record of inflammatory behavior. The institution hasn't fully disciplined him, if I have to be honest. Even the Black Academic Caucus criticized his actions, but structural response remains tepid at best. So, ladies and gentlemen, that brings me to the end of today's episode of 10 Minutes with Kuhle. I want to say that you can sign up for membership. It's as cheap as 20 Rand. It helps to keep the channel going. As well as, please do consider subscribing to the channel, because only 10% of you are subscribed. So do consider subscribing and sharing this message far and wide. This has been 10 Minutes with Kuhle, the only place where you will get the real truth. Till next time, keep safe, keep believing that this madness could possibly come to an end.
So when you tell us of corruption in South Africa in 2023, what you must alongside that tell us is the total structure of the social body in which that problem is found, and how that problem may be an expression of the basic social relations of that society. If it will help, a crude example. So if you want to explain corruption in South Africa today, it would be an uneducated explanation to tell us that there is rampant corruption amongst the political elite, without telling us that in a post-colonial settler society that South Africa is, you have two avenues of accumulation. The private sector, which is basically a preserve of white people. And because the private sector is a preserve of white people, where does the nationalist and the political elite go to accumulate? And by the way, accumulate in order to feed values that have been taught to it by the white bourgeois class. So where does it go to accumulate? Because the private sector is close to it. It primitivizes the state. It uses the state in order to accumulate, because the expectation is that as the elite, they must live precisely the same lives as their role models, the white elite. So in order for them to belong to this class together as the elite, they must have the same taste. You would see the white elite, or rather the black elite in South Africa, one of the things noticeable about it is that it has no values of its own. There's nothing about it that is autochthonous, that is independent. What it consumes, what it dresses, what it considers to be leisure, what it considers to be good life is all a mimicry of white life.